Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor with you in Vienna, Austria. Joining us, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, as usual, we have one main segment for you all today. That is on the economics of America's legal industry. That's been in the news with the Trump administration targeting law firms with some new executive orders. We'll try to unpack the role of law firms in the American economy in general. We also want to start off by talking about a few things in the news that have come up this week. But before we even get to that, we did actually have another message we wanted to pass on. Basically, it's a pitch for listener support. We've never done this before, as listeners know. We haven't really had to, but as you may have heard on other podcasts that you like, it's getting harder and harder to sustain podcasts just on advertising dollars. And here at Ones and Tooze, we've been talking about this for a while and considering different options. And we did think about putting episodes behind a paywall, charging listeners for access to them. Lots of people are doing that these days if you look. Or we could make episodes accessible only to FP subscribers. That's also come up. But honestly, we don't really love those ideas. We don't want to lose the connection to the community that we've built up over these past 3+ years, almost 200 episodes actually it's been. And, we don't want to force listeners who are on a tight budget, as many people are these days, to shell out money for Ones and Tooze. So instead, we are asking for support on a voluntary basis. If you can afford to pay $60 a year, which is what many weekly podcasts charge for access, we'd be really grateful. If you can only afford $30 or some lesser sum, well, that's fine too. There is a proud tradition of listener support in audio. We're kind of embracing that tradition here at Ones and Tooze and hoping that it'll allow us to remain sustainable. The process is very easy. There is a link in the show notes that will take you to a support page. The rest is self-explanatory. So please consider pressing pause right now and just following that link. If you're interested, we'll thank you by name at the end of our episodes. And from time to time, we'll figure out a way to reward supporters with tickets to live shows or stickers. Yeah, Adam, did I miss anything here?
No, Cam, I think that's very well said. Folks may know that I run my Chartbook newsletter on exactly the same basis and for exactly the same reasons. I love providing quality content, whether it's on the newsletter or with Cam on Ones and Tooze and with the support of the foreign policy team. But exactly for the reasons you've mentioned, I love to make it basically freely available and then appeal to folks who can afford it to show their appreciation and join the community in that sense by, throwing a few dollar bills in the can. And we very much appreciate it if you could do that in support of Ones and Tooze as well. I think we're really everyone is getting a sense right now of the importance of supporting media. And we'd really very much appreciate it if you were able to show us some love on Ones and Tooze. In future, in fact, we might very well, Cam, I think, consider doing an episode on the economics of podcasting and how media works more generally these days, because it's a topic that affects all of us and is, I think, one shouldn't get too high on soapbox, but it clearly does matter for the health of public life and in democratic societies and, in fact, in all societies around the world.
Yeah, I agree. That's actually a good topic, probably for all our listeners, and I'll add it to the kind of amorphous list I keep of potential topics. In any case, let's shift to the substantive part of the episode. As I mentioned, there are a few things in the news that we wanted to talk about, and the first is something that happened one day prior to us recording this, which is the declaration of new tariffs on automobiles by President Donald Trump. A 25% tax is being imposed on imported vehicles into the United States. And this is obviously a global story. And I'm just curious on the most basic level, who is going to be affected by this the most, or how should we be thinking about this new policy in the U.S.?
What it's clearly going to do is make buying cars in the United States much more expensive. I mean, that's the simple logic of it. And why this is the case is that half the vehicles sold in the US are imported, and cars assembled in the US contain large quantities of foreign parts, which by value, according to some estimates, make up 60% of the final value of the vehicle. And if you put a tax on these, there is then a struggle that ensues between the makers of the vehicle and the consumers, the market, as to who bears that cost. The underlying logic, insofar as there is one behind these tariffs, is that it'll in due course cause car companies to relocate production to the US. The UAW has come out in support of them. The stock market hates them. The shares of all American companies and indeed global automakers all sold off because, as economics would predict, one effect of making cars in the United States more expensive is you just simply sell less of them. There may be on the margin a shift from ones made in the United States towards ones made in the United States, away from those made outside. But the overall effect will also just be to shrink the market because it'll just be more expensive to own new cars. Trump sits there rubbing his hands, announcing this. People ask for details. There are no details. I think we really have to wait until April 2nd to see what actually emerges. That's the totally self-imposed deadline of the administration for all its tariff policy. Up to that point, I think we should expect this ridiculous circus to go on of abrupt announcements and then pullbacks. The fundamental question on this is going to be how and to what degree are cars circulating within the North American production system for vehicles? Because that's really the way to talk about it. How cars being made between Mexico, the United States and Canada, how this tariff applies to them. There was one reading of this which says that they will be exempt. But the problem, of course, is that the largest producers in Mexico are Japanese, and the parts that they use to make the vehicles are to a large extent sourced from outside the North American trade zone. So the tariff will almost certainly apply to those. The people that this will hurt most are poorer American consumers that need the cheapest vehicles. And it's not obvious that this will much boost American manufacturers, because a large part of the production that does go on in the US, especially by foreign manufacturers, is actually exported from the US. And those exports are very likely to face retaliation. So once you add up all of the effects, it's very hard not to paint a negative picture of this. While, the Trump administration and the, I think, incredibly short-sighted leadership of America's labor unions rub their hands in glee. But we'll see. April 2nd is the date. We shall have to do an episode immediately after that to see what has actually transpired after the dust settles.
So I wanted to shift now to another topic that is in the news, although it's also one that we've been talking about internally for a while as the subject of a potential segment here, and that is the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The war there has been happening for a while in the eastern part of the country, with rebels there having support from neighboring Rwanda. And it's an interesting economic story, not least because, the DRC is a country known for having a lot of minerals of the sort that have also been in the news recently with the Trump administration really placing an emphasis on trying to gain access to raw materials and rare earths and minerals of this sort, and kind of reorient geopolitics around gaining access to these kinds of minerals. But for me, this raised the question of whether the war is really about minerals in any way. And does this kind of worldview about the kind of transactional nature of accessing in these kinds of natural resources, does that help us understand this conflict, or does it kind of distract us from really understanding what's going on there?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating topic. And though these are supposed to be the spontaneous segments where we react to daily news, the fact of the matter is that I find myself going down the rabbit hole of East DRC ethnic politics in a way which means this is entirely rehearsed, because it's so fascinating. We should truly come back to this region for a segment or a whole series of segments. I mean, so the first thing to say about DRC is that where it is on the conventionally organized map distorts how large it is. It's the size of like most of Western Europe. So it's an absolutely gigantic country. that straddles, as it were, the center of Africa, but on one side reaches to almost the west coast, and on the other side reaches almost the east coast. So it's this huge lump, 105 million people. And it's absolutely rich with resources. So incredibly high-grade copper, 70% of the world's cobalt is mined there, coltan, diamonds, also lithium deposits. So, coltan and cobalt are these sexy, rare minerals that are used in high-tech applications like, the batteries for EVs and so on. So it's super easy to tell a story about the struggles in the eastern provinces of the DRC, which are a kind of resource grab on the part of Rwanda, which is this, the bully boy of East Africa, this powerful state that has emerged from the genocide of the 1990s as a major regional player. And it should also be said that the DRC leadership is kind of hamming this up for the sake of Trump and his simplistic worldview. Hey, Mr. President, come and do, a resource deal with us. It's also clear that informal mining in the east of the Congo, where the fighting is, helps to feed the conflict on all sides. Everyone involved is, involved in various types of informal mining and taxing it and taking the revenues. And there is smuggling going on to Rwanda of some of the produce of that. But the crucial thing to see is that the vast majority of mining that's going on in the DRC right now is formal mining. It's done in other regions of the country. It's largely under the control of very large Chinese firms, which are there legally on the basis of a treaty that gave them the privileges way back in 2007. And so the idea that the wealth of the DRC is being sucked out by informal mining operations backed by Rwanda is true only for a very small part of the story, insofar as it's true at all. And furthermore, the fighting in the eastern regions of the DRC is fueled by minerals and may yield some smuggling profits, but it's about something else. And, this is way above my pay grade in terms of African history and ethnography and everything else. But the basic outline of the conflict is between an organization called M23, a militia called M23, which enjoys backing undeniably from Rwanda. And then on the other side, a coalition really that consists of the Congolese army, foreign mercenaries, local militia groups, namely they're called Wazalendo, I think. Then there's some soldiers from neighboring Burundi, some South African peacekeepers, and then there is this rather nasty group called the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, FDLR. And once you break it down at this level, it becomes clear that this is, above all, a super complex struggle over ethnicity, over culture, over claims to nationhood, and over resources. But insofar as it's about resources, the struggle goes all the way back to the clash between settled agriculturalists and pastoralists. So it's that kind of an East African struggle, because the M23 represents local Congo Tutsi groups called I hope I'm not totally garbling this, Banyamulenge. And they are Congolese by any reasonable definition. They're historical, like other African populations, so they've moved around. No one has been where they've been in Africa forever, right, since the Neolithic or whatever. Just like most other places in the world, populations move. And in this part of the world, first the Hutu arrived in what would be, by European standards, the Middle Ages, so the 1000s, 1200, so on. Then the Tutsi arrived in what, by European standards, would be the early modern period. And by the late 19th century, the Tutsis had built a powerful centralized state that was then subsequently carved up between the Belgians and the German colonists in the region. And so what's happened is that Tutsi populations have been spread across what is now Burundi, Rwanda, and bits of Eastern Congo. In Eastern Congo, they are a tiny population. So DRC has a population of over 100 million. Demography in this region is vague, but it would be really surprising if the Banyamulenge were as many as 1 million. So we're talking about a sub 1% minority who have played an absolutely outsized role in the ethnic politics of the region for more than a century, who are routinely stereotyped as interlopers. Hey, you Tutsis, go back to Rwanda where you belong, kind of a politics. The sort of which you see a lot across Eastern Africa and indeed Southern Africa as well. And the M23 group emerges as their militia-style defense organization. And all of this tension is then heightened by the ghastly massacre in Rwanda, which caused, on the one hand, an escalation of the stakes in Tutsi politics and the horrible migration of the Hutu perpetrators to refuge in Congo, and they are the FDLR, which of course stirs up amongst the local Tutsis the fear that there is, as it were, both driven by Congolese resentment against them and this influx of Hutu genocidaires, a genocide brewing. And this is why this is such an intractable, deep problem in which really the minerals story, I have to say it's a little bit catty, but I think it's a way of journalists and outside analysts making this just mind-bogglingly complex, truly historical problem sort of immediately intelligible. Hey, this is what this is about, conflict resources, and we should be against it, and Rwanda's intruding. I mean, as a European historian, I look at this and say it's much more like Alsace-Lorraine, and it's kind of like a fractally twisted Alsace-Lorraine. So imagine the complexities of the Franco-German problem in that region folded on themselves 10 times. And then you've kind of got an image of the complexity of this. And of course, you can say Alsace-Lorraine is about control of iron ore deposits, but it's a pretty rough and ready simplification of what is a truly complex, fascinating, tragic, dangerous situation.
I'm glad you make that historical analogy, and that is useful, as analogies often are, in understanding the situation. And I want to move to one other topic before we get to American law firms that's obviously also been in the news, and I guess ask about analogies there as well, and namely the subject of El Salvador's prisons and how they're now hosting Venezuelan migrants to the United States who were then deported to El Salvador in an arrangement with the Trump administration, with El Salvador now hosting these deportees in the prisons, as is often the case in El Salvador, as I understand. They're put to work also in El Salvador with no kind of due process involved in figuring out whether these are criminals of any sort, as is alleged by the Trump administration. And I guess I was trying to take a step back to understand the situation, and I wanted to ask whether there's an analogy that fits, because I was sort of thinking about the financial transactions at work and the lack of due process, as I mentioned, and so is this a kind of like international prison business akin, in obviously smaller form, but is it akin in some ways to the international slave trade? I mean, these are bodies being sold for labor of some sort, prices being placed on their bodily existence. Is that precedent apt in any way that at least came to mind for me?
I mean, the images are horrendous, aren't they? I have to say. I mean, obviously, it's just one piece of a truly nightmarish landscape of coercion in various forms that we see around the world. But it was horrendous, and to know that this is being done in our name as taxpayers and citizens in the United States. And with so many tragic stories emerging of the utterly arbitrary nature of these arrests. I mean, anyone who was Venezuelan and had tattoos, basically. I mean, it's just utterly grotesque. But I don't think the analogy works to slavery, especially not to chattel slavery. I mean, let's think of it another way around. I mean, I think the basic logic here is coercion, repression, imprisonment, and transnational Central American gangs. I mean, that's I think the frame within which to put this. And in El Salvador, which I think we may have done an episode. I think maybe we did something about Bukele's Bitcoin crypto finance adventures. But I mean, he has built his administration on this utterly authoritarian crackdown on gang culture in El Salvador. There's like over 110,000 people incarcerated in a really small country. It has, I think, maybe the highest incarceration rate in the world. It's absolutely extraordinary. And he's built these prisons. They're not expensive by American standards. I mean, the CCOT facility, which is this, people will have seen the pictures, this nightmarish kind of warehousing of people. And apparently they boast it costs $70 million, which is peanuts, right? So basically this is an armored warehouse system. And that has capacity for 40,000 people. It costs them $70 million to build. El Salvador is deeply in debt, has public debt of $31 billion, 82% of GDP. And along comes Trump and offers Bukele, just all of these PR wins where he gets FaceTime with the president, and he's obviously Trump's idea of a friendly neighbor. He's into crypto. He's into violence against criminals. It's all good. And he's got bills to pay. And Trump offers, apparently, the going rate was 6 million. And I don't know how many prisoners the Americans contracted for, but those are American rates, right? That's $30,000 per head, roughly speaking, if that's the lot that are going to be transported. And Bukele literally said, like, it's peanuts for them. It's a huge amount of money for us. We take this. But it's not a productive system organized around, racialized labor. It's a coercive prison system, which Bukele wants to make pay for itself, both in terms of political capital and in terms of financial contributions from the US. If you actually want to see really large-scale coerced, prison economies that the US is involved in, you don't need to go to El Salvador. You can go to this place called Prison Valley in Colorado, which we might also want to do an episode about, where there's around about a dozen correctional facilities, and the entire economy of the region is organized around this. I think that I think we need to think of this as a punitive economy rather than a slave-based economy. It's an economics of punishment, of incarceration, which is basically being made to pay for itself. But of course, it pays for itself in lots of different ways. It pays for itself both in the presumably like small-scale manufacturing that they do in prisons, like in most places, but it pays for itself above all symbolically in that there is an electorate both in El Salvador and in the United States cheering this spectacular display of coercive power.
So with that, then, I think we should shift to our prepared segment.
To lawyers. Yes, where were they?
That's right. Exactly. From the utter lack of due process to the presumptive administrators of due process, at least in theory. The data point that I have there is $292 billion. That is the market size in the United States of legal services in 2024. That is estimated to be set to increase to some $466 billion by 2034, according to one estimate. But it's also a sector of the economy that the Trump administration has recently targeted with a set of executive orders. One executive order that is targeting specific law firms that have opposed the administration, or at least have opposed Trump in the past. Another that more generally encourages the Justice Department to refer any attorneys for disciplinary action if they file, quote, frivolous, unreasonable, and vexatious litigation against the government.
Since his inauguration, President Trump has taken 145 executive actions, and some have also targeted law firms.
His termination of security clearances for two prominent law firms, both of which have represented his opponents, such as the 2016 Democratic presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton.
We've taken action against a number of law firms that have participated either in the weaponization of government, the weaponization of the legal system.
And so, the basic kind of operating assumptions of U.S. law firms is now sort of being put in the spotlight. And obviously, it is an enormous sector in the U.S. economy. So we thought we'd try to unpack it and take a look. So, Adam, the first question that came to mind is that it strikes me that law schools have a special role in the United States compared with other places in the world. Growing up in the U.S., it was almost as if law schools were a kind of sink for humanities majors of all kinds who may have been unsure of what else to do after their undergraduate education. And I'm curious whether it's like that anywhere else in the world, and is that an expression somehow of America's basic litigiousness, which we've talked about, including last week in the context of talking about the new book, Abundance. Yeah, is this kind of role of law schools, a product of the money sloshing around in the legal system?
I think it's absolutely true that it's different to anywhere else. I mean, in Germany, lawyers occupy a key position in the power structure, but according to Klein and Thompson in this book, Abundance, there are twice as many lawyers per capita in the US as in Germany, and 4 times as many as in France. So the American story is different, and the law school system that feeds those people into the American economy, American society, is unlike anything that exists anywhere else in the world, I think. I was really it's one of the big surprises, one of the big learnings from moving from Cambridge, England to Yale, which you might think of as being quite analogous institutions, except there's nothing like Yale Law School anywhere in the UK. This hasn't always been the case. Like it's tempting, and Klein and Thompson fall into this argument of saying, well, America's always been like this. Go back to Tocqueville in the 19th century and you see it. But they also know, and this is, I think, the key point to make, which is that there was a steady increase in lawyers in American society through the late 1960s. But then what happens is there's this huge surge from the late 1960s onwards. So America's become much more litigious. There were about 300,000 or so lawyers in the US in 1970. There are now 1.3 million lawyers in the US. So there's been a very, very sudden increase in recent years. And this has added to their share of GDP. I mean, the numbers here are, vague. They generally are. You gave us one. Folks argue that the share of lawyering in GDP might be between 1.3 to 1.7% of GDP. That would put you in the $350 billion range in terms of value added. So that's, as it were, the value generated by legal professionals altogether. That's about, maybe on a high side, perhaps twice their share of the workforce. So that figures in terms of productivity. You might think of them as relatively highly paid professionals at the very top of the profession. And a lot of the time when we're, thinking about lawyering in the US or watching legal shows on TV, it's about big law. That group, there's a listing of the biggest law firms in the US. And if you look at that listing, the top 80 firms employ about 113,000 people. They generate $135 billion in revenue between them, which cashes out at about $1.3 million per lawyer in that big law system. So at that end, it's a very rich business indeed. And the top law schools and the law school hierarchy and the treadmill of those is driven by preparing people, the next 3, 4, 5, 6,000 people that will be hired into that mill of big law.
So then if we were to take a look at the labor patterns in the law firms themselves, I think it would be interesting to unpack that, because to me, it seemed quite Ponzi-like. I mean, as it is, basically droves of associates are hired, young, fresh out of law school lawyers, and they're then kind of put to work doing loads of grunt work in different cases. And, that produces both, income for the law firm, but also like the need for further growth in the firm to then like make those associates future partners to be able to afford that, or at least some subset of them. And then those partners then go on to hire other associates, presumably. And I'm, the sustainability of that strikes me as kind of questionable. And then it got me wondering about the role of AI sort of in law firms and whether that could be put to work doing some of the work that associates have tended to do in the past. And would that then change the entire model that we're talking about? Because then you don't even need the growth, at least relentlessly, that they've had in order to hire these associates into partnership roles. I mean, is that a kind of potential future of this labor model and maybe a potential change in the sector entirely?
I mean, the Ponzi model, I think it was Zingala's idea, wasn't it, from Chicago Booth, that like you think of the law firm like that. I mean, it's a useful analogy up to a point, but it seems to me to break down quite rapidly because the lure of the big ticket, the win, which will be the partnership in the big firm, certainly serves to pull people in. But when they opt out, it's not as though the whole pyramid comes down. They just spin off into more reasonable legal careers or into the legal departments of big companies that need advice from, people who used to work in those firms. In a Ponzi scheme, we predict catastrophe because it's this, runaway fire that essentially at some point burns itself out. Whereas in this case, in many cases, it's actually an incredibly stable social structure, which has a sucking effect because the rewards at the top are very large. And there's so many alternative positions for people to go into from a, successful but not quite partner level successful career in a big law firm. It's not like you become unemployable after that. Like there's loads of other places you can go. So that's, I think, the reality of the ecosystem is that people pile in and then funnel, a small funnel takes you to the top of big law partnerships. And then there's a wide range of other options. But yes, I think AI is clearly a threat to this profession and thank God, good riddance. There's an awful lot of routine checking, consistency checking, compliance checking, which currently requires legal eyes on it. Whereas in medicine, there's every reason to believe that an AI algorithm, a properly trained one, not one of the hallucinating kind, but one that is basically just looking for consistency in documents. So not being asked to creatively come up with chat, but is simply being asked, does the following document conform to the following regulation, will have huge impact. And of course, the lawyers are in the unique position that at least some of them, the most influential amongst them, will actually define the terms under which AI impacts what they do, because what will define is of course a business calculation on the part of the law firms, but also law. So at some point they're in a position to pull the brake and say, law requires that lawyers do lawyering. And there will, of course, be a shaking out process, a market-driven process. But unlike some other professions, you would expect them in the end to be able to regulate this flow. I think the big risk is that it enhances winner-take-all logics in the legal profession as well, in that, the firms that will be able to employ the best engines, the businesses that will be able to really harness this will be the firms which already are able to invest the most in legal competition, legal warfare. And it's important, I think, for listeners, if you're thinking about the legal ecosystem, not necessarily to think about major set-piece litigation with your day in court as the majority of what this legal ecosystem does. Most of the time, it's trying to avoid that outcome, right? Because that outcome is high jeopardy, and it's not tightly controlled by negotiation, because God help us, juries and judges and people like that will speak the final word. Whereas what you ideally want to do is to mobilize legal firepower in what's more like a trench warfare, very small scale positional shifts, which we all then agree are the standard status quo. And that can be with the judicial authorities, where you navigate what will and will not be litigated. So AI will play a role, but I think it will be largely confined to those routine roles. But who knows, at this stage, everyone's guessing about AI's impact. You would certainly think of this as one area. If AI is good at anything, it's coding. And what is the metaphor that we routinely use for law? It's code. So this would be a space where you'd expect it to bite.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about big law. So to stick with law firms and how they work for a second, I'm curious how the corporate structure, the corporate governance of law firms affects how they work and the decision making that they engage in. I mean, obviously, law firms are not kind of traditional corporations with shareholders and shareholder value being the determining factor in making decisions. Instead, you kind of have this partnership model that I mentioned. Yeah, and I'm curious how that affects decision making and strategy overall.
So, I mean, there's this great quote from David Enrich, the New York Times reporter who's done a lot of amazing stuff on big law, where he says, there's only one thing that could make a big law firm more rapacious, and that is turning it into a publicly, listed company with shareholders. And there's only one thing that could make it more aggressively profit-seeking, and that would be for it to go public. And that's the logic which we've seen applied also to, say, investment banking, which moved from a partnership model to, say, Goldman Sachs is the classic example of this. The flip side of that is that though partnerships have some degree of capacity for self-regulation when it comes to money grabbing, on the other hand, they're also essentially political, if you like. They're governed by the preferences of the senior partners and the top dog, whoever the top dog happens to be in the firm. And to that extent, they're flexible, they're fast moving, their preference functions can be quite complex. They don't necessarily have to be driven entirely by, one single variable and maximizing revenue. But on the other hand, they can be. And it's really up to that inner circle to decide. So you would expect some degree of heterogeneity, I guess, as a result of the partnership model, because you'd expect the preferences of partners to be articulated in different ways. And that's not necessarily inconsistent with profit maximization. It could just be different views of how you go about the tricky business of trying to maximize benefit. So I think it's the judgment of that insider, Enrich, was that the only thing that could really make them even worse would be if they were, publicly listed corporations, and that we would be better off perhaps settling for the somewhat arbitrary and capricious partnership model instead.
Yeah, maybe a lesser evil, perhaps. But to shift to Trump's executive order now, obviously his targeting of frivolous legal actions against the government, that seems like pretty clear BS, and we don't need to give credence to it. But it did get me wondering if there is, in fact, a lot of just unnecessary, even unethical legal action in the U.S. context. I mean, like, if we consider a lot of what law firms do, we obviously there's a kind of noble role for them in providing legal defense for people facing prosecution. But, a lot of what they do is helping clients avoid regulations, whitewashing reputations, avoiding taxes. I mean, should those kinds of legal services offered to corporations oftentimes, even be considered in the same category as, a kind of, more noble legal defense for individuals?
I think the short answer is no, and they aren't. That's not what big law does, right? Big law is essentially about that entire other realm that you summarize so well, Cam. That's what big law is about. Corporate interests. Those are, generally speaking, best served by avoiding litigation, by various types of more or less aggressive, under the blanket, inside struggle between similarly equipped corporations on the other side. Litigation and the threat of litigation is not with a view to achieving a final judgment, but with a view to forcing a settlement, an out-of-court settlement of some kind, before you ever get there. And this has been rehearsed over and over again. And there's an entire logic, even inside the government itself, of how far they want to go in terms of pressing, well lawyered large corporations, how much damage they're willing to absorb when they risk taking companies to court. The nightmare case is the Arthur Andersen consulting firm that used to be like this dominant, McKinsey rival in the 1980s, 1990s, and was just dissolved by the impact of the Enron debacle. And in the wake of that, apparently in the DOJ, there was quite a lot of decision making that said amongst lawyers that really in future they should avoid the disaster of bringing down a major corporate player like that, and do everything in the form of this corporate to corporate legal bargaining rather than, aggressive litigation, which is one of the ways then that they proceeded when they handled the financial crisis of 2008. All conflicts, all tensions in American society at a high level are going to, at some level, have a legal component. I'm speaking now from, as an employee of Columbia University, which is involved in precisely such a struggle with the American government, which is threatening us with a variety of different suits, and high-powered legal teams on the Columbia side are strategizing about how best to respond. That's where they earn their money. That's where the big bucks are made. That's what big law is about. It's a key element of brokerage. In the US, even, if you look at the development of the foreign policy apparatus in World War II in its aftermath, many of the key players of American globalism, in that, the emergence of America as a global power, they're also lawyers. So, and when we think of business people, quite often what we're actually talking about is not, somebody who runs a factory or somebody who, does deals like Trump, but somebody who is a lawyer who thinks through contractual arrangements. And that's where, much of the smarts of, modern business practice actually resides. So yes, ethical, unethical aside, like in terms of like managing conflict, managing tension, they play an absolutely crucial and comprehensive role.
So I guess I wonder in this context, what role should we think that pro bono work plays? Pro bono work being the kind of volunteer works that law firms offer to those who can't otherwise afford their services. Is this basically, the function of this is it to allow corporate law firms to present their work as attractive to idealistic young legal students? Is it basically a function of laundering big law's public reputation ultimately?
And the astonishing thing is the answer is yes, and they're totally explicit about it. So you just have to Google that question, and bunches of articles in professional legal journals come up explaining to you that the advantage of a firm doing pro bono work is it's great for recruitment, it's great for corporate morale, it keeps people on side, makes you look, in so many words. It's no secret. It's the question, I guess, is how much do they actually do? Whatever their motives are, how much do they actually do? And the firms will trumpet that they do a huge amount. But you can actually cash this out because the American Bar Association has like a target number of hours of pro bono work. They actually recommend a certain number. And it's 50 hours per year. So then the question is, how many billable hours does your typical senior lawyer clock up? And that would be the recommendation in most major law firms is somewhere between 1,700 and 2,300 billable hours per year. So take the middle there. What if people met the Bar Association kind of norm of 50, they would be doing just over 2% of their time on pro bono work. So 98% of the time would be, for fee. 2% would be pro bono. If you actually look at what companies incautiously announce as, we did these hours, and then you translate that to the number of lawyers they've actually got on their books, you'll find that more often than not, very, very large percentages of the American legal profession do considerably less than that. So in total, if they actually met their collective professional standard, they would be making a pro bono contribution of 2%. And the evidence suggests that the biggest firms, even at their moments when they're celebrating what they do, are actually advertising the fact that they do rather less.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to know that my intuition was precisely borne out by the law firms themselves. Okay, we will end the conversation here for now, but as always, we'll be back next week with other topics. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.